There's a new show on the BBC called The Mash Report, which BBC iPlayer calls a satirical and surreal news show. Nish Kumar and a cast of hilarious correspondents keep you up to date with everything that has happened or not happened this week. But I argue that despite it being called satire, that it isn't actually that satirical, or not as much as it could be. I also think that this is caused, one, by having to be a weekly recorded and broadcast show in order to stay topical, and two, the jokes in them often aren't actually that satirical. That's a big one. And three, certain choices in regards to presentation and the way they filmed it actually prevented it from being as satirical as it would or could have been. In order to make some of my points, I will compare the MASH report to The Day Today, a satirical news programme on the BBC from some 20 years ago. And maybe then I'll add some other reasons I don't like the programme, simply because I'm a grumpy and cynical human being. But of course, before I begin any of that, I'm talking about satire, so I need to define my terms. I'm going to say what I think satire is and what I think satire isn't. And this definition will be the one I mean when I use it in the rest of this video. Please note, while you may have a slightly different definition of satire, perhaps one that actually encompasses both the day-to-day and the MASH report, or maybe even neither, irrespective of that, I will demonstrate that both these shows are fundamentally different in their approach, such that this video will still actually be useful to you. But personally, I consider the MASH report to be merely topical, spoilers, while I consider the day-to-day to be more satirical, and we'll get into that later. So, what do I mean by satire then? Satire makes humorous use of imitation or parody in particular, often in combination with exaggeration and a hint of irony to highlight and criticise certain aspects of its target. Satire is typically political and typically punches up, that is to say, its target is someone or something in a position of some authority or power over others. So no, you can't use satire as an excuse to make a racist joke. There has to be clarity of purpose. Also, I recommend you watch at least an episode of The Day Today and The MASH Report to get a feel for what they're like. But I'll describe the general layout of an episode of The MASH Report if you haven't seen it anyway. So let's do that. It starts off with host Nish Kumar doing a short comedy bit on some story in the week's news, and then we'll move to the news desk, and then back to Nish for more of the same, or to Rachel Paris, and then back to Nish, and then to the news desk, and then back to Nish, or Rachel Paris, and then on to a bit with one of the side guys, as I'm calling them, then another news desk, and then back to Rachel Paris maybe, for fake internet comments, and then to Nish again, probably, maybe. Look, the important thing to note is there's 3 bits with news desk. Remember that. That's the important bit. So, how good a satire is the MASH report? Is it even satire? You might take one look at the title and the way it is presented and think, ah, yes, it is clearly satirizing the news. It is obvious. Why are you even asking this question when you can see plain and simple, well, you're wrong. Or at least that's what I think. I disagree. You might even agree with me. The show opens up with a theme tune and some graphics of spoof headlines which combine to make landmarks and stuff. It doesn't really look or sound like a news opening, but, you know, I guess it's fine. It's fine. But when you compare it to the day-to-day...
Top gets tonight.
It does seem a bit pointless in comparison. The day-to-day opening sequence is full of purpose, it's over the top, it's brimming with grandiose self-importance. The graphics and the music as the news just turned up to 11. The globe transforms in such a ridiculous way to form the day-to-day's title. It's just great, and it mocks the news's aura of authority effectively. What starts off the show after the title sequence in the MASH report is host Nish Kumar saying,
"Hello and welcome to the MASH report, the show furious not to be nominated for a fake news award."
A joke that sort of references the fact that it's not really a news show. So like right off the bat the meta's broken because the opening gag is, haha, guys, this show has stories that aren't real, But would it be funny if they were real on the actual news? And then what happens is Nish Kumar takes a couple of minutes to talk about the actual news that's been actually happening. It's essentially John Oliver but Nish Kumar and stood up. Well, I mean, the first bit he stood up. Later on he sat down, so it's just John Oliver but Nish Kumar at that point. But that doesn't necessarily make it a satire. He's just making jokes about what was talked about in the mainstream media that week. It's the kind of jokes you might see on Have I Got News For You and Mock the Week. Nothing is being parodied and exaggerated. It's just a comedian telling jokes. Nothing's wrong with that if you like that sort of thing. Nish Kumar does decent, though liberal, social commentary, but it's not quite satire, is it? It doesn't comment on or criticise anything other than what the content of the joke is commenting on. And often in satire, the way the joke is told and by which character all contribute to criticise and comment on the target of the satire. More on that later. After the opening gambit, Nish hands over to the news desk. Aha, look, at last, the satire we were all looking for, right? Well, this part of the show definitely does attempt to be a satire of the news, but I don't think it's as good as it could be. First off, the jokes themselves. There are two kinds of jokes that the news desk does. Let's consider each in turn and consider how effectively satirical they both manage to be. The first kind of joke is the relatable headline joke, where they say a jokey headline in the style of a news reporter and then it cuts to a picture which is either the punchline or is just sort of added in at the end. Like, here's what they just said, but a picture now. These jokes are sometimes quite identical to ones from Have I Got News For You, for example, but they're done by two news reporters who, to be fair, do look and sound like real news presenters, but news reporters don't just sit there reading headlines one after the other to camera. Cutting to the other one doesn't hide the fact that the format is not really like a news program at all. Plus, the jokes also seem like rejected headlines from The Onion or Clickhole. As a quick aside, those sites work because they look and function identically to any other news site trying to get you to click on its headlines. Using those headlines as a quick relatable gag on Twitter, for example, works. And they usually also have an article expanding on the joke on the site for those interested or fooled. But you can't just take the idea of relatable joke headlines and then read them to camera dressed up like a news presenter and hope that works. The jokes should match and fit with the format you're parodying. As an example of this being done well, let's look to the day-to-day to see how they achieved a funnier effect with a very similar type of joke.
The headlines tonight: NATO annulled after delegate swallows treaty. I'm so sorry, yells exploding cleaner. And bearded cleric in oily chin insertion. Those are the headlines. God, I wish they weren't.
Everything about this is similar to an actual BBC news programme right off the bat. The music screams news, the delivery is spot on, and importantly, all it is the presenter reading over footage relating to the headline. This makes it so much more effective and funny because of the juxtaposition of being exactly like the straight-up self-serious news with such absurd headlines as
Headmaster suspended for using big-faced child as satellite dish.
The day-to-day derives its humour from its imitation of the news, whereas the MASH Report's headlines are jokes in and of themselves, and the news style and presentation is more of an afterthought. The kinds of jokes they make and the way they are told don't fit with what a newsreader would read out. The only time a newsreader would read a headline over a still picture or have a still picture up after they read a headline is when describing maybe a murder victim or a serial killer or something like that, and sometimes not even then. The day-to-day's opening bits, through absurdity put alongside imitation and exaggeration, says that the mainstream media takes itself so seriously to the point of fetishization.
This is the news!
They are proud and noble spewers of absolute truth directly into your brain, and the results of that are hilarious. The MASH Report's headline gags, on the other hand, there doesn't seem to be more thinking behind them beyond, what if it was like the news, but funny? And that doesn't say much other than what the individual jokes themselves say. That is, there's no point being made about or using the way the joke is told, only in the subject of the content of those jokes in and of themselves. Also, the subject of those jokes tend to vary wildly, so they don't all point to one particular theme either. There's another problem with the MASH Report which the headline gags also make very obvious. In fact, the problem permeates through most of the MASH report, and that problem is the live studio audience. As already mentioned, the headlines don't feel like something that belongs in a news programme, and the studio audience contributes to that feeling. The headlines, which again are effectively just jokes, are read out one by one, and because of the studio audience, the whole flow of that bit, which might make it work despite not actually being like the news, is completely thrown off, because it has to stop and stall for the laughter. I suspect this is also the actual reason for having the pictures after every punchline, just to give time for the audience to laugh, as they sometimes even show a picture when it's completely unnecessary for the joke to land. For example, this may be mildly ableist headline gag.
Trump's cognitive ability normal. He's just a prick, says White House doctor.
BBC pay row looms as it's revealed that Nick Grimshaw gets paid.
It just cuts to a picture of Donald Trump with his thumbs up for no reason. Also, later on in the episode, the news desk is back again, and this time they don't use pictures for two of the gags, and the pause for laughter where the reporters just look at the camera saying nothing at all is even more glaring.
Tough guy cyclist asserting authority with Tinkle Tinkle Bell.
Gilet wearer admits his arms have been cold for years.
Tough guy cyclist asserting authority with Tinkle Tinkle Bell.
Gilet wearer admits his arms have been cold for years.
Not to mention the fact that the studio audience being there and laughing after every funny bit does undermine any attempt to make it seem like a news programme. They tend to not have a studio on some BBC News, obviously, but further, every laugh reminds you you're watching a comedy. The live audience alongside the unrealistic presentation makes you very aware that you are watching a comedy show. What this does is it makes the ridiculous joke headlines seem less ridiculous, because you're watching a comedy show. Jokes are normal in a comedy show, but not on the news. The jokes would be much funnier if they committed really hard into being like the news, which is why I think the day-to-day is just more effective. The second kind of joke done by the news desk is a description of a story followed up by a live interview or a clip by a different reporter. One problem with the second type of gags is that they are shoehorned in with the headline gags, but the setup for the interview or cutaway bits is actually very similar to the headline gag, so it's quite an abrupt change of pace to go from stop-start with the headlines and waiting for laughter, and then suddenly moving into a longer piece. I think this could have been easily avoided by only having the headline jokes be read out the first time we visit the news desk, and next time we visit the news desk, maybe have the longer stories, and then the third time, then do interviews. That way, it would also allow the story and interview skits to be fleshed out more and to be longer, and it also would allow potentially more time to be spent on each element. Unfortunately, it is quite clear that the constraints of having to make a weekly topical show come at a detriment to these story bits, as they're all just a shot of someone speaking in front of camera in front of a green screen, which again makes the whole thing feel like a hastily put together impersonation rather than an accurate imitation and exaggeration of the news. Furthermore, the content of the jokes of these live interviews and stories amount to little more than an expanded version of the headline gags. It's either observational humour or humour playing on a stereotype. Weirdly, it seems to pick on young people and students specifically quite often, painting them as naive and or pursuing useless fields. Wait a minute, that's me, they're mocking me.
The NHS is now so bad that performing arts students are being drafted in to pretend they're A&E doctors. Due to severe staff shortages, patients are now being treated by drama undergraduates who are not even fully qualified in saying words and dancing about. Earlier, we spoke to pretend A&E consultant Nikki Hollis.
It's fine until you have to start doing medicine to them. Sometimes you know what to do, because if someone's got an eyeball hanging out, obviously you just pop it back in with a bit of blue tack. It's harder if their insides are ill, so what I do is I give them every type of pill and just hope one of them works. Sometimes it makes them not hurt, but sometimes they have a very long sleep and a man takes them away.
So if you are ill, just hope your local university has a good drama department.
It's not exactly punching up. Punching Up would be talking about maybe privileged students, inequality in universities, or maybe all the fucking debt. Not mocking a hypothetical student for supporting Jeremy Corbyn's apparent policy for free tuition.
Students are in a state of shock tonight after discovering Jeremy Corbyn isn't real. It emerged that kindly bearded figure who they believed would come down their chimneys with money for tuition fees was actually just made up to get their votes.
So I was told that Corbyn comes at the start of every term on a sledge pulled by a socialist reindeer collective. That he wears red, obviously, and if you've been studying hard for your degree, then he brings you money and a jar of homemade jam. Then last week, I had caught my dad signing a cheque for £9,000. Like, it was them all along, not Corbyn.
The Labour Party has since denied starting the Corbyn myth, although it confirmed Tony Blair is real and lives in a drain preying on the innocent.
Don't get me wrong here, I'm fine with mocking Corbyn, he's a politician, he's fair game. But they're just kind of using him as a vehicle to mock students again? Like, what is your problem with students? What have we done? Also, jokes about the NHS crisis, when Punching Up would highlight the rampant defunding it has been subjected to in order to use its inevitable decline as an excuse to privatise it. Not to use the NHS as a way to say that students that do arts and drama courses only know how to prance about. Wait to hold the powerful's feet to the fire. Oh, they really won't be able to prance about after that scintillating burn. Not that they could anyway, because all the fucking debt was weighing them down. But what would it look like if the MASH report had longer, funnier, more satirical stories? Yep, you guessed it. Let's take a look at the day-to-day, episode 5, and a bit from it that I consider to be, quite frankly, brilliant.
Today's historic trade agreement between Australia and Hong Kong marks a new season of hope for the future of world trade. The two countries have been at each other's throats for years, but now the hatchet's been buried by a treaty which allows unrestricted trading between all parties at all levels. I'm joined now by Martin Crace, the British Minister with special responsibility for the Commonwealth, and Gavin Hawtrey, the Australian Foreign Secretary in Canberra. Gentlemen, this is pretty historic stuff. Well done. A future of unbridled harmony then, Australia?
Yes, I think Martin Crace and I can be pretty satisfied. It's a good day.
And if, as in the past, Australia exceed their agreement, what will you do about it?
This is a very satisfactory treaty, which I'm sure will work well. Naturally, if the limits were exceeded, then this would be met with a firm line, but I can't see this being necessary.
Mr. Hawtrey, he's knocking a firm line in your direction. What are you going to do about that?
Well, in that case, we just reimpose sanctions as we did last year.
Sanctions? Hang on a second. They've only just swallowed their sanctions, and now they're burping them back up in your face.
I think sanctions is rather premature talk. Certainly, if sanctions were imposed, we should have to retaliate with appropriate measures. But I can't see...
Appropriate measures is a euphemism, Mr. Hawtrey. You know what it means. What are you going to do about that?
Well, I just have to go back to Cabinet.
And ask them about what?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's a matter for the military.
The military?
I think military measures is totally inappropriate reaction, and I think this is way, way over the top.
Sounds like you're being inappropriate, are you?
Of course I'm not being inappropriate, but Martin Crace knows that full well.
This is the sort of misunderstanding that I thought we'd laid to rest during our negotiating period.
Misunderstanding it certainly is. It's certainly not a treaty, is it? You're both at each other's throats, you're backing yourselves up with arms. What are you going to do about it? Mr. Hawtrey, let me give you a hint. Bang!
What are you asking me to say?
You know damn well what I'm asking you to say. You're putting yourself in a situation of armed conflict. What are you plunging yourself into?
You'd like me to say it?
I want you to say it, yes.
You want the word?
The word!
I will not flinch.
You will not flinch from...
War.
War. Gentlemen, I'll put you on hold. If fighting did break out, it will probably occur in Eastmanstown in the Upper Cataracts on the Australia-Hong Kong border. Our reporter Donald Bethlehem is there now. Donald, what's the atmosphere like?
Tension here is very high, Chris. The stretched twig of peace is at melting point. People here are literally bursting with war. This is very much a country that's going to blow up in its face.
Well, gentlemen, it seems you have little option now but to declare war immediately.
Well, this is quite impossible. I couldn't take such a decision without referring to my superior, Chris Patton. He's in Hong Kong.
Good, because he's on the line now via satellite. Mr. Patton, what do you think of the idea of a war now? I'll take that as a yes.
Very well, it's war.
War it is.
That's it, Chris. It's war. War has broken out. This is a war.
That's it. Yes, it's war. From now on, the Day-to-Day will be providing the most immediate coverage of any war ever fought. On the front line and in your face, Donald Bethlehem.
Standing by, Douglas Hurd.
The Day-to-Day smart bombs have nose-mounted cameras. This is Smart Bomb Stephen, and that is Susanna Gekkelois.
I'll be reporting from inside the fight.
Like some crazy Trojan. And keeping an eye on everything that's going on out there at the Day-to-Day news pipe, Douglas Trox. Chris. But first, the weather from Sylvester Stewart.
It starts off as any regular story you might see on the news, but you soon realise something's up, and it escalates into such a ridiculous war fervour, which is then undercut by...
And now the weather.
It at once makes you laugh and accuses the media of relishing, glorifying and shifting public opinion on war. It's punching up as its target is again the media itself, and again it uses imitation and exaggeration of it to make its point. The MASH report does attempt to be satirical at times. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it gets Piers Morgan to show everyone him eating the president's ass. And that absolutely is commendable. I'm glad the MASH report has existed, if only just for that. But I feel like it's let down by its apparent need to be like any other topical comedy programme. The pre-written satirical bits don't work in large part due to the studio audience's presence, or seemingly due to the time and production limitations caused by having to do a topical weekly show. So it's occasionally satirical, but not a satire, if you know what I mean. Okay, so there's some other things about the MASH report that are worth mentioning, but to get into it I must warn you, this is the angry bit. Welcome to the angry bit, where I talk about the things that pissed me right off about the MASH report. You see, there's something about the MASH report that's almost worse than the studio audience existing. And his name is...
Jeff Norcott!
And I almost don't want to dedicate a couple of minutes to being angry about him, because that's probably exactly what he wants. But I think there is some merit to talking about him in relation to the rest of the show. So let's dig in. Jeff Norcott is such a perfect fit for BBC producers, a Tory with a working class sounding accent to make his reactionary bullshit pass as humour, and his role in the TV show is very strange, because at times he seems like a parody of a typical right-winger, except that's actually what he believes. Which is weird, because literally every other presenter on the show other than Nish has a persona or a character distinct from themselves, including Andrew Hunter Murray, who is the other person who sort of shares the slot with Jeff Norcott. But with Norcott, it's more like an attempt at a sweary Daily Mail opinion piece. It's bad enough when it's just an awkward interview where no one is quite sure whether he's a genuine prick or just pretending to be a genuine prick. But sometimes they even let him do VTs where it seems like he just goes around talking to people who affirm his views. In episode 3 of the Winter series, he goes on about the dreaded Canvas 3. There was actually a bit of that Norcott VT which did make me laugh, because while he was complaining about liberal snowflakes censoring everything, he was swearing, because that's how he tries to make you laugh. So it was being censored and bleeped out.
It seems like censorship has gone crazy on campus.
So people on benefits who, if I see them, I would them in the and then them with a muffin. Did I be able to say that?
Yes. Censorship has gone crazy.
And the irony of that caught apparently no one's attention, and it was... it made me laugh, but I was also very angry that it existed. I mean, this topic has already been done to death by the point this was broadcast, so safe to say any nuanced detail, or dare I say research, is forsaken by journalists that cover this topic, even ones that also write for The Guardian, by the way.
The sort of lily-livered types that will seek out jobs of genuine influence, or end up working for The Guardian.
And Norcott's VT is no different, except he thinks himself as the funny Tory version of Danny Dyer, so it's actually no different to a crap think piece. And this epitomises another problem with the MASH report, and other topical comedy shows in fact, because it just does what the media does, but in a funny way. It's not satirising the media, it is the media. It's just regurgitating its talking points, but with jokes, and occasionally they'll satirise something or do something funny, but these shows never really rock the boat, nor do they give a genuine alternative viewpoint. Norcott being on the programme causes some other problems. And just to make clear, I don't have much of a problem with him existing as a person, mostly, but he especially doesn't fit on the MASH report. His interviews or skits are usually sandwiched in between quite a few jokes about white male privilege or patriarchy, which makes the point or commentary over the show contradictory for the sake of some kind of balance, but it really just doesn't fit. Both Norcott's and the other parts of the show are made worse by the contradiction, and the show as a whole is made worse because it makes it seem like it doesn't really have a coherent stance on anything. Another gripe I have with the show, though this applies more broadly also, is this.
On the dreadful flu that's going around, Tranny Magnet says, don't let the NHS rip you off with their expensive flu jabs. Immunise yourself by drinking other people's snot.
First, women have told everyone to just fuck off. Tired of being judged for choosing to have children or not have children, to have children and go back to work, to have children and not go back to work, for being too thin, too fat, too pushy, too unambitious, too hot, not hot enough, or even for just daring to be alive, women have stressed that everyone can go fuck themselves. Nathan Muir has been gauging the reaction because apparently a man is the best person to report this story.
If you have a vagina, people have the right to judge you on every single thing you do, even what you do with your vagina. Or so it has been up until now. I spoke to one of womankind, or the clitorati, as no one is calling them, about their backlash.
Enough's enough. The message is clear, and the message is, you're right, we will do as you command. Just kidding, it's fuck off.
It's 2018, not all women have vaginas, not all men have penises, please stop using transphobic slurs. I mean, it's really strange that even 20 years on from the day-to-day, transphobia is still tolerated. And this is a point of criticism for both programmes, by the way.
More proof was provided by the out-of-body experience of Leslie Safrat.
I could actually see myself coming out of my mouth as vomit, but it wasn't just as vomit, it was like as vomit in a dress, and then I woke up and I was a woman. I went into my experience as a man, but left it as a woman. Something definitely happened, but I don't know what.
So how do you explain the case of Keith Phillips, who returned from his out-of-body experience as a woman?
He didn't.
But we've filmed it, and there's an awful lot of evidence to show that that's the case.
No, there isn't.
Here's an image of Graham Linehan, who is in the transphobic episode of the Day-to-Day. I'm just stating some facts in a particular order, nothing more, nothing, I'm not accusing anything. Okay, before I get too off topic, let's wrap this thing up. The MASH report sucks, and I need some sort of satisfying conclusion to this whole thing. The climate currently is ripe with big targets for satire, but the response to, for example, President Trump in UK comedy television has been weird. Like, Channel 4 put out a panel show called The Fake News Show, where they talk about news things that may or may not be made up. Whoa, take that, echelons of power! The last thing I remember that you could actually call satire is probably The Thick of It, and that ended in 2012. Now the only thing is topical panel shows, and the MASH report, the scope of which does not exceed that of a topical panel show, in my opinion. But all of these are considered satire, at least according to the BBC, but I think shows need to be better to deserve that label. Because for me, satire has more value than mere entertainment, not that entertainment has no value, but satire holds within it also the potential to chip away at power structures in society, be they cultural or institutional, maybe by stripping it of its dignity and authority for all to see, or painting it as absurd and ridiculous. And if there's one thing power hates, it's laughing in its face.